A very, very warm welcome to the fifth in our series of online conversations, Cultivating Wisdom, with our overriding motif about how can we live, act and lead wisely in this current environment with all its challenge and all its possibility. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by George Kinder. Are you there, George?
Hey there.
Oh, there you are. There he is.
Julian.
I could describe you in so many ways, George. Activist, writer, poet, photographer, philosopher, teacher, so many things. But above all, for me, just a true inspiration for helping individuals lead better, more satisfying lives and really challenging society to move to a better place. And I so enjoy my comradeship and friendship with you and all that. And what a delight in the next 25, 30 minutes to talk with you about wisdom and your notions of wisdom. And I'm not sure how to start, George, whether it's to, what do you make of some of the conversation we had so far, or whether you'd like to go straight to how you see wisdom, but just want to invite you in.
Yeah, first of all, the community you have is just fabulous. And I feel it's a privilege to be amongst them. And to hear the frames that have been used, the frame of El Camino and the frame of the empty void and something percolating there. And of course, I love following my great friend, Mr. Blake, I think of him as, but
yes,
Tim
Mr.
Heath.
Blake, Mr. Tim Heath Blake.
So it's been wonderful to, and it's a privilege to be part of this, and I'm delighted. Wisdom's one of my favorite topics, so I'm thrilled to be here and engaged with you around it.
Sure. And George, you've written about it, haven't you? And transforming suffering into wisdom. Golden Civilization is essentially about bringing wisdom into society and civilization. Right. Take us into that, George. How would you shape us around wisdom, the notion of wisdom, from your point of view?
Well, what I like to do is go to the root of it in some way, and that's something I've liked to do all my life in terms of, I've done it in the life planning movement. I try to take people to what their roots are, what's deep inside them, and then define their flourishing from that. And I think that's a lot has to do with what wisdom is and is all about. In a way, I mean, we frame wisdom sometimes as a way of thinking or a way of relating. And I think it's deeper than both of those. I think it's deeper than thought. And I think the way of relating has to do with time and with our relationship to this moment and each moment as they arise. So I think wisdom has very much to do with the nature of time. And as a consequence, I think that wisdom, as well as not only, I mean, one of the things we wonder is whether wisdom can be accumulated, whether wisdom can be developed in society and institutions inside ourselves, or whether wisdom is kind of fundamental to us in a deep way. And there's a way in which we all kind of intuitively know that when someone does something wise, it's like taking us back to the beginning of things in some way. And I think wisdom is embedded. And what happens is that in some way we've lost that connection. And that embeddedness has to do with the nature of time itself. That wisdom, one of the ways you've heard me frame, kind of time, not merely about wisdom, but about freedom. And that is that freedom occurs only in the present moment. We've never experienced a moment of freedom in the past. We'll never experience one in the future because we only experience it in the present moment. So recognizing that, I've tried to look at, because freedom has been what I based all of my career on, the professional career of life planning. So I tried to look at, what is that then? What is it about the present moment? And what happens when if you pursue the present moment and that's it, and there are various ways of doing this, we might talk about that. If you pursue the present moment so that your relationship with the present moment becomes both more and more intense, alive, familiar, comfortable, what happens is that you're beginning to create the possibility of more and more freedom because you're more alive in the present moment. But what is simultaneous to that is that when you meet the present moment, when you really meet it, you can't meet it mediated by self. So you can't meet it if you go, oh, I got that moment, or yes, oh, look at that. That's just like what happened to me back then, or I'd love to take this and do this every day going into the future. If you're mediating the present moment like that, you're not experiencing the present moment. So the self takes you away automatically from an experience of the present moment where I think both freedom and wisdom reside. And the reason that wisdom resides there is that in order to actually meet the present moment, you have to let go of the self. So selflessness is cultivated. And what's beautiful about this particular approach to wisdom is that it means that wisdom, because that selflessness is like a state. So sometimes we think, well, wisdom is like a state of being. But then other times we think, no, it's an application of something inside of us to a situation around us. And what I want to suggest is that wisdom, when we think of it as having to do with the present moment, has both of those elements in it. That the present moment, when as we approach it and experience it in a selfless way, we go into all the wonderful virtues that we know. We go into what Powe will probably talk about in terms of Vedanta and kind of the truth of things, the deep, deep layer of consciousness, of truth, of wisdom, of self, of all of that. And so because our small self, our individuation of self has been abandoned. And so we find generosity, we find kindness, we find courage, which is incredibly valuable right now in this time of crisis. So we find all of these, all equanimity, tranquility, concentration, all of these virtues are found when we let go of ourselves. And if we bring ourselves in, we're trying to appropriate it, and they're constantly slightly tainted and eventually become significantly tainted. So the first thing is that by having a relationship with the present moment that's pure and direct and simple, really simple, what happens is that we're accumulating virtue and this base of wisdom, the state of wisdom. But the other thing that happens is that the present moment won't let you in a way. It is incredibly, I mean, it's impermanent, and it is relentless in that impermanence. There's a thing in physics. I just read an article about it the other day, but I've studied this for 40 or 50 years, that there's a smallest moment of time is 10 to the minus 33rd seconds. And it's it's a quantum of basically of time. And it's much too small even for our neurons to grasp. So time, we think of time as a flow, but there's also this notion of it of being quantum. And when you approach the present moment, if you approach it in that quantum nature, it keeps throwing you back into the world. So what happens there is it brings enormous energy into you, and also rapture and joy, because you're selfless and you have this energy, there's this vitality that's just astonishing. So what that movement back into the world is, the way I think of that, that's where freedom comes, that's where our experience of freedom is, where we're just alive and we're just, in it. All the stuff is flowing by us so quickly, and we're filled with vitality. So I think the cultivation of the present moment leads to a kind of wisdom that has both this base and has automatically an engagement that has purity and simplicity within it, but has all the virtues in it as well. So to finalize this part of the conversation, the way I define it, and I know you were aiming in this direction, is that wisdom is the selfless understanding of the present moment and the impermanence that surrounds it. So that's a very simple, and it's a wonderful frame to then practice with in a meditative kind of way.
The selfless understanding of the present moment and the impermanence that surrounds it. And there's so much I want to inquire of you, George, on the back of all you've said so far. The selfless relationship to the present moment, letting go of self, accessing something that's deeper than thought, right to the beginning of things, the virtues. Can I go with you on that, George?
Sure.
So why is it why? I want to ask first why and then how. My why question is, why when we do that, do human beings find those virtues deep down in terms of thought? What do you turn to? Why is that the case, that these deep virtues are so profound in us that if we can selflessly access the present moment, we can find them there? Why are they there, George? To the extent that's possible to answer. And then I'd love to talk a bit about the how. How do we, you practice, for instance, how do we practice to live wisely in a way where we can access that selflessly? What's your sense of the why?
So the why, it's a complex thing, because the way I understand now how the world works in a way is that there are, in a way, 3 layers, and it's all thrown off from the present moment. It's all accessed, mediated by the present moment. So one of the layers is the layer we live in, this time and space layer that's filled right now with COVID and dysfunctional democracy and worries and the Homo sapiens. Can we survive? Do we actually have it in us to become great and good, or good, even better, just good? And so that's one layer. And that's a layer that's filled with delusion as well, because we miss this explosive nature of the present moment. We miss what freedom really is. We get attached to freedom being out in the past or somewhere in the future, and freedom's right here. So, so what happens when we go to the present moment is that we're accessing we get to access 2 more layers of the universe, of how the world actually works. I think this is, the nature of the universe is the present moment throwing off time and space, and accessing for us this deep relationship to virtue. My hunch is, it would be easy enough to say, well, it must be that spirit and virtue is at the base. Well, that's how I've described it here. My hunch is you can't exclude any of these areas. My hunch is that all 3 are fundamental. And that the most powerful and important one is our relationship to the present moment. So my hunch is that virtues, wisdom, great spirit is fundamental. And it's fundamental to anything that experiences moments of time. So my hunch is that it's even fundamental with rocks and subatomic particles, not nearly with the complexity, perhaps, that your and my brain can work with, but that it's there, embedded.
And George, this is too simplistic a question, but just to help those in terms of really understanding the thinking here, what has shaped this for you? What have been some of your influences? Where are the roots of this? You mentioned Vedanta. We've talked more about Buddhism and all those traditions and art. And where have you turned mainly to inspire you in this thinking?
So I want to say one more thing that will lead me to that in a way, and that is that I used to think of the universe. My first book I wrote was on subatomic physics, and I interlaced Hindu philosophy, a lot of Vedanta, into that book. It's the only book I never published, but it's a favorite of mine. It has a bunch of prose poems and ink washes and all kinds of things, as you might expect. But I think the universe is not about time and space. I think the universe is about awakening. So the universe is really about our relationship to the present moment and what do we do with it? Do we respond to the present moment by being reactive and neurotic and acting like a formula, a mathematical formula, which is how time and space are constructed in our science? Is that how we relate to time and space and the universe? Or do we relate to it with great kindness or generosity of spirit? Or do we relate to it by creating something extraordinary, which was what Blake's imagined paradise is all about? And my hunch is that that relationship to the present moment, coming out into time and space, accessing virtue, is what the nature of the universe is. So where does that come from? A lot of it came from my own kind of investigating, but the practices, if I were to list the people who have influenced me most over the last 20 years or so, certainly Buddhist thinking, a Zen poet who lived in poverty named Ryokan, a Christian saint named Saint Francis who also lived in poverty, Johann Sebastian Bach, as you know, William Blake, without any question, and Bob Dylan's had a lot to do with my relationship to protest. So I think those would be the primary things. And I keep coming back to, so I've done spiritual practice of many kinds over the years. In my early days, the teacher that I took on was a Hindu teacher. He died 100 years before, and he had a visionary relationship with the world. So he was the closest thing to William Blake that you could find in the Hindu tradition, really lived in vision. And so the two of them together were like, blew my mind. And so I did my hand at visioning and all that kind of stuff. That was kind of, that was fun to do. But his teaching was, go after every deep teaching there is in the world. Don't waste your time with the preliminaries. Go right for its depth. So my initial practice was 16 years of going after the depth of every single teaching.
Okay.
After that time, I realized I want to be a teacher. What do I teach? So I went to him, this teacher. His name was Ramakrishna. And I went to him and I said, what do I teach in a visionary state? I went to him and said, what do I teach? He said, you'll know. Oh. Thanks a lot, buddy. So I went around and went to all the different centers at that time. And the one that was most direct, most related, because I was living in Cambridge, you know, MIT is there, Harvard's there, filled with analysis and thinking and science. And I thought, I've got to have something that these guys can respect. And I went all around. There was a lot of, you know, new age kind of stuff. And the one place that had really responded with factual stuff and was closely related to psychology was the Theravadan school of Buddhism, the early teachings of the Buddha. Wow. And so I dived into that practice. And that's been pretty much the story of the last 34 years of my spiritual practice, has been really meeting the present moment, pursuing the present moment, learning from the present moment.
Wow, George. Wow. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
And might we go a little bit to the how? So, you know, if people listening now about acting and living wisely and accessing deep virtue, what would you say to us about practices? And as we talk about that, I'd love to gradually move to the context in which we're operating, which is full of challenge and opportunity, isn't it? And we've talked about the states at the moment right now, which, you know, it's never experienced probably. Would love your perspectives on that, you know, sense of practice, but the sense of practice in this moment, and what you see in the world right now, and how can we act and be to the best effect in such a challenging moment.
Yeah. So really there are two questions wrapped in one in a way. Yeah. And I think one of the things that I wrote about 15 years ago or so, one of the ways I'm just having a ball right now is that I'm writing poetry every day. I'm editing 20 years of poems, 600 pages of poetry, and they're all about the present moment. And it's kind of wonderful. I'm learning from these experiences I had in the past. And one of the frames that I used for a year or so is that the world is inside out. And you can see that when I take you down to the present moment, that we think of the world as being out there in time and space. But the real world, the world where we have the greatest impact, comes from our relationship to our present moments. And the more wise we are in that relationship, the more then impactful we can be out in the world. So as you know, I wrestle tremendously with the tragedies that we find ourselves in right now that, you know, I view as having been completely unnecessary, both the economic tragedy that we're facing and even more coronavirus. It's something that in the West we could have really stopped, and America's been the worst of the bunch, UK not far behind, and we really could have stopped it. And so I wrestle with that a lot, but I think that I do kind of this meditative practice several hours a day. And the reason is that when I do it, I'm clearer, I'm fresher, I'm more engaged, I'm delighted. And so when I come out into the world that has all this darkness, I can read the darkness without getting totally angry, frustrated, depressed or whatever, and find some ways to go forward. So I'd say whatever practice you can do, whether it's 10 minutes a day or as I do several hours a day, the more you can practice a spiritual practice that is not putting down some other system or people or whatever, because sometimes we get attacked. A lot of spiritual practices are attachments to belief systems. And then if you aren't in my belief system, then there's something, you're a devil or something like that. So a spiritual practice that doesn't have that element to it. And my favorite is to practice with the present moment. And it really, and using something as mundane, as simple, as ordinary as the breath is wonderful because of its simplicity. It's still as challenging as can be. And just coming back to it again and again and weeding out all the self-thoughts, all the past and future thoughts, and keep coming back until your hand fits in that glove of the present moment just perfectly, time after time after time. That's an extraordinary practice, and endlessly rewarding and endlessly challenging. 50 years on, I'm just as challenged by it. I mean, I can have wonderful ones, but I'm just as challenged by it. So that practice, because it's dealing with the present moment, it gives a lot of energy as well. And so that energy is what we need to bring right now with the wisdom that comes from selflessness into this engagement with the world.
So wiser relationship with the present moment in service of impact. I mean, I jotted down some words I'd heard you say recently, and you've been echoing them now. And I want to just repeat them because I think you're speaking to them so powerfully now, George. So I'm looking down at my notes here. I heard you say, keep diving into and meditating on the present moment again and again and again, embracing the tremendous stillness, raising our deepest and best selves to engage in the world with profound generosity of spirit to help ourselves and others envision and move towards a much better world. That's what you're saying, is that sense of wise relationship with the present moment, which galvanizes our virtues to be in contact and, well, pushing the external world. And I mean, George, perhaps we might gradually conclude around that. I mean, right now, what's your sense of, I mean, I'm using the framing of challenges and possibilities. I mean, what are you seeing right now? It's just for 2 or 3 minutes, particularly in the States, coronavirus, economic challenge, leadership poverty, Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, polarization, and yet a sense it's seeping into feeling, and in that comes real possibility. What's your sense of the moment now, of acting and being in this world right now, with all that you and I are fired up about trying to build a better world?
I was birthed in a way as an adult in the Vietnam era, civil rights era in America. And in that era, at that time, I was married to a woman whose father was dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Yale. And he felt that time, he was a liberal, but also very much a capitalist. He went on to start their business school there. And he felt that time as one of the darkest times as a time of tremendous chaos, because of course we were all rebelling against the administrations of all of those universities. And, but I have never experienced so much darkness, so much chaos in America. And by that, I mean right down to our moment by moment engagements with each other. And this is the unhappiest time. We are glum, and we are beaten down by the news constantly of our completely dysfunctional executive branch. We just can't believe how stupid, how harmful. As I said, we've now got 130,000 murders. I call them murders because they never should have happened, the deaths from coronavirus. And the murder of our democracy would be even worse, because then where are we as civilization? Is there hope for Homo sapiens without a really strong Western democracy that the US is part of? Because Europe is fragmented as well. It's hard. We need America's strength and optimism and entrepreneurial engagement around all of that, I think. And so it's the darkest time I have ever experienced. And, having a plague that's around at the same time, having an economic depression, it's the darkest time. And of course, the racial injustice, what we've seen is something that gives many of us hope, but also it's easy enough to say, that's going to fail once again. My hope, superficial hope, is that the politics of the Democratic Party of Joe Biden will become something like the FDR Roosevelt movement in the Great Depression, and that we will see massive and sweeping changes. But I think there's reason for that optimism right now, but there's so many months ahead of the election. Who knows? And who knows what the forces will be. The inequality in the country and in the world have grown so much that the powers against that kind of change are significant. They're what is built up, this humongous hierarchy that we're seeing right now. So the thing that I love about what you're doing, Julian, and bringing it back to your community, is that I think we need both this interior wisdom to cultivate it, accumulate it, act upon it. It brings both virtue and energy if it's done well. And we need that throughout society from an interior standpoint. But we also need to transform the hierarchies of power, the institutions that we have, so that never again do we find a lack of wisdom at the top of any hierarchy of power all across the planet. And that wisdom filters down all the way, permeates down all the way to the base. And of course, the base, as we're training this cultivation of wisdom, it also permeates all the way up. So we need, in addition to this cultivation of personal wisdom, we need to understand that we need to do some structural changes. 250 years ago, we had this great industrial revolution that has given us so much, but it has failed to give us wisdom at the top of every hierarchy of power. It's time that we completed that work.
Wow, George. You know that I could spend hours and hours in conversation with you, but we have to draw this to a close. And I just wanted to say one sentence and see what your last sentence might be. So what would be your last sentence? Mine would be that even in these darkest times, if we can be even wiser in our relationship with the present moment, we can have more impact. And boy, do we need to have more impact right now.
Yeah,
what would your last sentence be, George?
Well, it's a cliche, but the darkness is always greatest just before the dawn, and we need to have that kind of hope in order to stay the root, to stay with it, and because we need all of our energy and all of our cylinders on fire to make this transformation in this world into a golden civilization. It's time to do that.
George, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian.
Looking forward to more conversation as ever, but thank you.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.